Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming to our presentation. Our presentation explores equitable teaching in ESOL classrooms. My name is Ikuko Fujiwara, and joining me today are Alan Bradshaw, Matthew Johnston, Pamela Chui Kadakia, Amy Pedroza, Zora Washburn, and Joan Zelea. We are a group of dedicated ESOL instructors from the American English and Culture Institute at Dallas College Richland campus. Equity is one of our top priorities as educators. We continuously strive to create an equitable learning environment for our ESL students. And the sudden move to teach fully online in 2020 due to the pandemic has pushed many of us to think about this topic more deeply because the need for equity became even more complex, urgent, and overwhelming. With many students never having learned online, not having proper equipment, and having to deal with so many personal struggles, our beliefs of teaching equitably were put to the test on so many levels. In this presentation, we will be sharing what we have learned from our experience in a roundtable conversation format, looking specifically at teaching equitably in ESOL context. Our hope is for you to walk away with something to really consider and something you can immediately use to create an equitable learning environment for your ESL students during and even after this pandemic. Because the takeaways from our presentation are applicable online and in a face-to-face environment. Also, please note our handout. We have prepared a handout that highlights the key points of our discussion, along with some recommended readings and references.
What is equitable teaching in an ESOL online classroom? Through our lived experiences, we have realized that equitable teaching in an ESOL classroom is about establishing an inclusive learning environment as we reduce gender, race, cultural, economic, educational, linguistic, technological, and physical inequities. We should carefully consider a student's circumstances and be accommodating whenever necessary. We should be aware of how our own assumptions and social, cultural positions impact the way we teach and the way students learn. ESL students feel the unique experience of studying a second language in another country. Therefore, it is especially important to pay attention to linguistic, educational, and cultural impacts. It is crucial to promote and encourage diverse ways of knowing and learning and to honor the whole student. We have come to understand that equity work is not only about picking up a strategy and applying it, but begins with a commitment to a lifelong self-reflective process that requires self-awareness, humility, mindfulness, continuous reflection, and empathy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Kadakia, and I'll be your moderator for this session. So lined up a few questions for the group here. Starting off with, what do you consider an equitable learning environment for your ESL students, and how did that change for you during the pandemic? And I'm going to toss this question to Joan.
Thank you, Pam. For me, an equitable learning environment is one where I think about my student as a whole person. I think about all of the different needs that he or she might have beyond just the academics, and then I try to provide an environment, a learning environment that's really dynamic and engaging. The one key thing that shifted was to be very present. I had to spend a lot of time preparing my lessons and then getting myself ready to be really enthusiastic, really patient with my students, to make sure that that 1 hour that I had in class, they really felt like I was engaged with them. I wasn't losing my cool if things didn't go the way that they were supposed to go. So that was the big shift. The pandemic really didn't, all it did was highlight everything that we already knew was wrong with the system. So I just was much more dedicated to really being there for them and really getting to know them so that if things came up in class that were beyond the academics, I could address it and they could feel comfortable enough to tell me. And I couldn't do that if I didn't have a relationship with them. So I spent a lot of time. When class would start, I would ask how they were feeling, what they did the previous night or that weekend. Since a lot of us were watching a lot of Netflix, recommendations for what to watch, favorite songs, and then sharing the playlist of songs with them. Little things like that to kind of get a sense of what they like and who they are. Beyond the usual, where do you come from? How many languages do you speak? What do you want to study in college? Like that was also addressed, but also the other little things, the kind of fun things that would happen. And then making sure every class that I reiterated that I would be available during office hours, that they could text me through Remind if they needed anything, and that I would be there for them, even outside of our office hours or class time, to address anything that they might encounter.
Yeah, so for me, my understanding towards equity became a lot more deeper and complex. And what access means really shifted for me, and it became much more political and socially conscious. And I realized that it's about justice. It's about what is the right thing to do for each of our students, and that's a really tricky question, because what is right is, there's no universal understanding towards what is right, right? And it's also about building student agency in a fair and just environment. Again, a very, tricky issue to really think about, very complex. And it's about how to create an inclusive learning environment, but more importantly, it's about realizing how difficult and complicated it is to create such a inclusive learning environment. And so for me, I think that shift happened because I think it has to do a lot with what happened last year, where our personal lives and professional and academic lives fused and blended, and the boundaries sort of disappeared, right? So we had to learn how to make them work together, which is something that I'm still struggling right now. And so much of what we do or what happens in our personal lives really, really impacts our work. And for the students, their learning. So as a teacher, I realized that it is really important for me to not ignore and dismiss that realities of students that are filled with tensions, politically, socially, economically, physically, and emotionally, because so many of our students live in the United States by themselves, away from their family, from their home country. So they miss their home countries and family in such a profound way. So for me to create an equitable and inclusive learning environment now means thinking about all of those things as I think about access in ways that I have not thought of before.
Thank you, Ikuko. And I think you're so spot on. I think one of the things as far as creating an equitable environment in the beginning, pre-pandemic, we thought about equity as like evening the playing field, making sure all students have access. And like Joan was saying, when the pandemic hit, it really just showed the cracks that were already actually in existence. And it challenged us to think about this more. And as students weren't able to access things, or as the playing field became even more inequitable, it shifted our thinking to not just about equity, but about social justice. So I'm right there with you. Thank you. All right, so for our next question, what is the first thing you consider when creating an equitable learning environment for your ESL students? So Matthew, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I think self-reflection and humility are the two words that came to mind when thinking about what I first considered in thinking about equity. And I really had to think about where I was and how I was doing and my own limitations, but then also consider that my values, my background, my cultural norms are not the same as my students. And that's okay. and I needed to value each of their backgrounds and values and cultural the cultural things that they bring to the table and bring to the classroom. And I needed humility to do that, to be able to listen and to be able to approach my students with an open mind. I had to kind of take a step back, rather than asserting my ideas so strongly in the classroom. I need to spend time listening. And Joan spoke about getting to know the students, and I think that's so important.
And I really appreciate you pointing out that it takes humility and self-reflection and seeing and not always pushing our value systems on others, whether it be students or just in life in general, right? But particularly we have to be vigilant in the classroom space because there's a power dynamic there as well that's at play. Mm-hmm. And I think that moves very nicely into the next question about, you're speaking about values and shifting values. So what were some values that you held, I'm curious, that you realized, oh, I can't be imposing this on my students?
Yeah, the first one that came to mind was the high value that I place on the written word and written communication. And I think perhaps as American culture, or just my own background, that the written word is so valued. So I had to recognize that, and then also recognize that my students might not place the same value on the written word as I do. So for example, email communications, for me, that's the go-to. And I want to make sure that the grammar is correct in the email, that the format's correct in the email. And I really value that. But then I have to recognize that my students, they communicate differently, and that's okay. And that it is effective. And so I have to recognize that, and I can adjust to meet their needs better. So I started using emojis, for example, and I started using the Remind app to text my students because that was more, it was more what they were using. And then I also, because the written word a lot of times was not what they valued or used to communicate and to gain information, a lot of times they're watching videos. So I moved more towards that, to make videos for instruction, but then also to allow students to submit videos instead of for them to type up their assignments.
Joan, would you like to take a stab at this question about how your values may have shifted during the quarantine to create a more equitable environment?
Yes. As the writing teacher, that was a huge struggle, right? To focus on the written word. But I think that for me, the shift was really the high value that we place on perfectionism and this really greater sense of urgency, which I think our students already bring that to the table, particularly about writing and grammar. They want it to be perfect. Our course is only 8 weeks, so we already have, it's an intensive course. So there's already a sense of urgency in the course. But with the pandemic, it just seemed just more heavier, more real. And so I had to really adjust so that they could see that the pressure that we were all feeling really wasn't helpful. I had to show them that this emphasis on writing a perfect piece of writing is counterproductive. It's not sustainable. I had to think about, why do we have the objectives that we have in our curriculum? Do assignments have to be submitted in the usual timeline that we had in a face-to-face environment? So I adjusted all of this, and I tried to model for them that mindset and that behavior by being much more flexible with them and the deadlines, meeting with them individually. So we would meet for 1 hour, and then if they wanted to work one-on-one on their writing, I would do that. It didn't matter how many times I had to meet with them. The motto that I had in class was progress, not perfection.
Joan, I love that you mentioned being flexible, because that was another thing I realized was so important. Probably prior to the pandemic, I was very inflexible about my schedule and my time. and it was my time, right? I was very rigid about that, and even maybe controlling about it, that I had a 9 to 5 work day, and I had classes at set times, and you know, if students were late or something, almost took it as a personal affront against me, because I valued that kind of monochromatic time is kind of one thing I value. So I had to, especially during the pandemic, it really challenged me to be more flexible, because I needed that flexibility. Now I have kids at home, I'm working from home, and there are times when I'm late to things because I'm dealing with family things, or I'm holding a baby or something. So I realized that I needed that flexibility, and that helped me kind of shift my thinking and recognize that my students, they might value time differently or see time differently, but also they probably need that flexibility as well. So my students might message me or send me an email or something outside of that 9 to 5 time.
Right.
And prior to the pandemic, I would not have answered it ever. But now I realized I needed to have some flexibility there and be available to my students, you know, not at midnight, but when I could.
I really enjoyed, I found that the times that I met with them outside of the, you know, our 9 to 5 schedule, that's when the organic relationship that I wanted would come out. When I'm washing dishes and they're talking to me about their essay, and they're confused about their thesis, and they're shocked that I'm accepting, you know, a call with them at 6 or 7 when I'm eating or doing laundry or whatever. That's the thing that was missing. And I could see that they were so appreciative, and learning, at the end of the day, learning is what matters, not that it's submitted on time, or that they have to learn to be, you know, college students, and this notion that we have of what it means to be a college student. I think all of that went out the window. And I got that feeling that I think we are all missing from teaching online. That thing that you get, I could say all teachers like, of interacting with students. I got that. Sometimes at 8 o'clock at night, but it worked. It got the job done.
I also want to go back and highlight for a second something you said earlier: progress, not perfection. And I think that's so important for us in ESOL and in the entire field, pandemic or not, because we're all learning this language. Even as native speakers, we collect and grow in the language every day. And it's important to allow the students to see that that's normal, and it's okay to not be perfect as long as you grow and learn.
Mhm.
Sometimes this concept, this value of perfection, can push us to almost lose our humanity. And I think what we're finding now is, even though we're disconnected from each other, you're finding we're showing each other our humanity, like when you're doing your dishes and on the phone with your students. That's amazing. They get to see you as a human being, as a whole person, and not just this figure in the front of the classroom that's like bestowing information on them, right? That's wonderful. And moving on to our next question, we have that we've all experienced unique struggles when it comes to the pandemic, personal and professional. And as you considered what you were going through, how did those considerations impact your teachings? And how did those considerations of your students' emotional and mental well-being change your class and interactions with your students? So I'm going to toss this one to Zora.
Thanks, Pam. I'm echoing a lot of your sentiments here, but similar to Matthew, I had to go from a very black and white mindset to, focus on the gray areas. I think I got this idea from one of y'all, but I really did start to become flexible about due dates, right? And I remember when I first heard that idea, I was kind of taken aback. There was a physical reaction there. Like, if there's no due dates, then how are they going to know when to turn things in? But I really did. I started to feel many days in a row where I was fatigued, right? I had lack of motivation. I didn't want to get things done. And I realized very quickly that our students are feeling the same things. And I have it relatively easy compared to some of our students. They have families at home, they're working full-time jobs, they're trying to kind of fit in their classes. And also all of us are, going through a pandemic. So I really wanted the emphasis in my class to be placed on whether or not they could get the work done, whether or not they could practice and learn, than completing the assignments on a schedule that, I've relied on in past semesters. But I think that my kind of pulling back and giving them that responsibility allowed them space to kind of step up and take responsibility in their own learning instead. So that was probably the most useful thing that I did.
So for our next question, it's regarding our students' language abilities, particularly obviously because we're working with English language learners. It can be really challenging for our learners to follow instructions online. So what considerations have you made when it came to their linguistic abilities? How did you adjust your courses to fit this online environment regarding whether or not they could access the language? Ikuka?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a very important one for our student populations. And I really try to imagine, what it's like to learn in a language that you don't identify as your own, and what that must be like, especially in an online platform, and how long it might take, how long it might take for my students to not just complete the task and assignments, but to listen or read and understand the lessons and instructions. And it's not that hard for me to imagine, because English is not my first language and it doesn't come naturally for me. So I think about how long it takes me to process information in English, and or to understand questions in English, or to understand or follow the most simple instruction in English. Like, for example, following a cooking recipe, which seems like really simple enough, just a few words, and the vocabulary is not that hard, but it actually is really, really difficult and time-consuming, and therefore stressful for me. And that's what I imagine what must be happening to my students. And it's most likely, even more draining for them. So I keep telling myself that even the most seemingly simple instructions in English are really difficult, time-consuming, and therefore stressful for our students. And they're usually taking 3 or 4 ESOL classes, right? So that pushes me to think about mainly 4 things. The first one is to really reduce the amount of work compared to how much I used to complete in each lesson in a face-to-face environment. So I really brought that down significantly. So focus more on the quality, rather than the quantity. And I keep the instruction really, really simple and predictable. And I'm almost obsessed about this. I can't. Simple and predictable to myself, just to make sure, that's just to remind myself that I keep it that way. And the third thing is I try to adjust the language and format as the weeks go by, depending on whether the students seem to understand the instructions or not. So I try to be flexible with the language and the format as well. And lastly, lots and lots of repetitions. So I explain the instructions over and over and over again through various modes, emails, text messages. So I would meet them one-on-one. And it's a strategy that I used to use a lot for lower level students. But I realized that even the more advanced students actually need this. And I think the online learning environment really impacts their confidence, the linguistic confidence. So it seems like they need that reassurance they actually do, their understanding is correct. So I try to, take all of those into consideration.
Thank you, Ikuko. And thank you for giving us those practical tips about the things that you do to make sure instructions come through clear.
And I'd also like to touch a little bit on something that Ikuko was talking about, specifically about giving students instructions. If we think about the in-person classroom, we may remember, oh, I just had to tell them once, but that may have not been the case. You had written instructions on the exam. You talked about it in class, probably at least once. If a student had a question while they were taking it, they could just raise their hand and say, teacher, could you explain what this instruction means? And you may have already explained it 5 or 6 times by the time the student has completed the assignment. So we have to think of ways to kind of replicate that in the online classroom, right? And so even doing something as simple as recording your screen, not editing it, just 15 minutes of raw footage is so much better than basically nothing, right?
So moving on to our next question, how do you adapt to the students in environments that are disruptive in their learning or the learning of other students in the online space? So Alan, let's start with you.
So I know the discussion about webcams has already been well trodden when it comes to technology, but to take it outside of that and think about autonomy in space, it really is about respecting a student's space. You have to think about 1 year ago, 2 years ago, the thought of your professor seeing the inside of your bedroom would be horrifying, or your classmates seeing the inside of your bedroom. It's not something that you want to open up to everybody. And by requiring a webcam, you're essentially kind of telling the students, you have to open up your space, and not everybody's willing to do that. So that's why I think it's really important to give students the option. If they would like to join, if they would like to welcome you into their home, I think that's okay. But if they don't, I think we also have to respect their space.
Thank you. And I really have to agree with you on that. I know as on the teaching end, to come to a classroom with a lot of cameras off can be kind of disheartening because we, as teachers, we enjoy that face-to-face and in-person interaction with students. But the way that you frame that allows us to rethink what that request really means when we ask them to turn on their camera.
So yes, webcams are one thing, and the microphones are another. I think all of us by this point have experienced the student who has someone in the background cooking, or the dog. I mean, even while we're filming this video, my dog is like nudging my leg and whining, and I'm having to turn on. There's distractions that are going on. It doesn't matter really, where you are. There's things going on in the background. So just like a lot of these ideas about equity that we've talked about, the biggest thing that I did was shifting my thinking. So a lot of this disruption in the background, it was out of my control, and for some of our students, it was out of their control too. But it did require a lot of patience from everybody. Even patience for me. Sometimes my lawn people were right outside my window as I was trying to talk about a certain grammar point. So, we all just were trying to do the best that we could and be patient with each other.
Yeah, no, I think, Zora, your point about being patient, so much. I would take time before class and kind of just breathe and just say, patient, be patient, and smile. Because a student will have some noise in the background. Disruption also in my class was often because we talk about what we're writing, students talking over each other or coming in late and saying, hey, I'm sorry I'm late. What are we doing? Or, and just wanting to hit the ground running. No, and you want to know, I had students not have patience and would start in the chat saying, hey, dude, shut up, she's trying to talk, or, stop talking so much, or, and I'd have to take that moment and say, we have to be patient, we have to listen to everyone. Because, I mean, that's what would happen in a class. We would never tell our students to not talk. We would never, first of all, we would never say, shut up. But we'd have to, these are all skills that they have to learn. And so I would approach it that way. And for students that would chronically interrupt other students, I would address that in a one-on-one meeting.
Because I had a student complain as well, Joan, and he actually turned on his mic and said, "You need to stop interrupting the teacher," to the other student, and I was mortified. But I did address immediately. Actually, I said, "It's completely okay. I'm fine with being interrupted because I know sometimes you guys have a question in your mind. But if it's making others feel uncomfortable, how about let's all agree as a community that unless it's a really it needs to be asked right now, just type it in the chat." Right. And I always got to the questions in the chat. So several students actually adopted that and it worked out quite well. So we've all faced the challenges of adopting a test to an online environment. So can we share a little bit about how you changed your assessments through an equity-informed lens? And let's start with Mr. Matthew.
Well, I think we've already talked about kind of moving away from the perfectionism mindset. And then also we can think about the process versus the product. So breaking apart assignments into smaller parts. And for me, that was by giving students a weekly exit ticket. And that was kind of a short assessment every week. And students could, we could kind of break down the parts of larger projects or larger assignments or written assignments. And I could evaluate how they're doing in the process. And I could celebrate, and most of them were able to get through most of the process. And we could celebrate that. And then so with that, the weekly exit tickets, the mini quizzes over, some big final exam at the end, or breaking apart assignments. And that also helped me gauge how students were doing each week, rather than just, give them a lot of information and then see what happens at the final exam. I could really analyze how they're doing week by week.
So I tend to be very much rigor focused, I guess is a more polite way to say what my students sometimes say my class is like. And they tend to appreciate it for the most part. I've had students tell me I appreciate you keeping us on track. And sometimes it was kind of hard, but I learned a lot. But so I know what reaction some people will have to hearing the next thing I'm going to say. So my final exams, for example, in the in-class environment, I would limit them to 2 hours. And I would say, this is a hard time limit. At 2 hours, everyone's done. If you need, and I explained it to students by saying, if one student needs 2 hours and another needs 4 hours, did they really perform the same way on the test? But I had to really change my mindset once we went into the online environment, because it's not just about language or reading or whatever other ability. It's technology issues, which we all know, so I'm not even going to talk about that. Typing, not from a technological perspective, but from a linguistic perspective. If any of you have tried typing in a language that isn't your mother tongue or your most proficient language, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. It takes a long time. I'm also a fluent Spanish speaker, but because I never type in Spanish, it takes me a very long time to do so. And people can also get interrupted because they're actually at home. What if somebody comes in, one of their kids comes in and asks for dinner, or they hurt their finger, or God knows how many things can happen in the at-home environment, right? So I decided my class or my final exams would instead be open for 24 hours. And if they took 30 minutes to do it, that's fine. If they took 10 hours to complete it, that's fine. And I think that was a really major change for me. But I've seen that the students apply the same level of effort to it at the end of the day. And I can maintain the same level of rigor.
Cool. Something for us to think about as we move back to the face-to-face environment. Maybe exams will look different. All right. And then Ikuko, did you have anything to add to this question about assessments?
Well, not so much. I think I just really completely agree with what Alan was saying. about the disciplines and times of exams, I think I became much less focused on those disciplines of exams about, how long it's going to take or how to avoid cheating, that kind of thing. I really stopped thinking about those. Well, I still think about it, but I think more about the real purposes and objectives of the exam. I always think about like that bottom line. So what is the objective of this assessment? And which is something that I used to think, often when I make any assessment, but I thought about it a lot more and, much less about the time issues too. So I kind of follow the same model as Alan.
Okay. Well, we've approached the end, ladies and gentlemen, and I just want to open the floor here for any final thoughts.
Yeah, for me, humility and grace were kind of the two words that were highlighted as we had this discussion. I already talked about humility, to be able to know yourself, and then to be able to listen and really know your students. And then grace for yourself and for your students. So knowing that we're in this pandemic time, we need to have grace, especially. But when we get back into the classroom and things are normal, we still need grace for ourselves and for our students. Knowing that we each bring other things than just education into the classroom. So we have to recognize that, and that will help us to serve our students. And to be healthy ourselves as well.
Remember also to have patience with yourself and with your students, because everyone needs it at this point. And so it's really important that you are remembering to take deep breaths, as Joan said, and to just kind of channel that patience when you are going into your classes and when you're interacting with students, because we're all struggling through this, and we're all getting through this in the best way that we can.
I guess my final thought would be to never underestimate the power of a smile. Our students, our cameras are on, so they are watching every move we make. So be mindful and smile. That'll make a big difference. The second thing I would have to recommend, and my final thought, I can't stress how important it was to rely on my colleagues to help me get through these last few semesters. So if you're team teaching, whether you're team teaching or not, I would recommend finding that support network of colleagues where you can vent and where you can flesh out any concerns you might have. We had very interesting conversations about due dates, about how flexible we can be and what plagiarism and cheating look like. So it will help you maybe address things about equity that maybe you haven't addressed, or so it'll be a learning opportunity, but it'll also give you the support that you need to get through it. Because patience and grace will get you far, but even further if you're in community. So that would be my final.
Yeah, I think I'll actually build off something that Ikuko said earlier, because I felt that it was very poignant. She mentioned considering or thinking about what's the objective of this. And I don't necessarily mean like the bigger picture, but like about the different tasks that you have or the different assignments that you have or whatever it is in your class. Especially if you have something that you're having a very difficult time adapting from the in-person to the online environment. Take a moment to ask yourself and have a little patience and say, like, why do I necessarily need to do this? Why do I necessarily need to include this? What is the objective of making this final exam into 2 hours and online, for example, or doing this group assignment that is much more difficult to carry out online? And whether we've been teaching 1 year or 10 years or however long, we all have routines that we fall into, and kind of asking yourself about the objective of things is an important part of like reconsidering and having some healthy skepticism about things, I believe. So that's kind of all over the place, but what I kind of want to emphasize is don't be afraid to be creative with what you're doing in the classroom. Do something different. It's okay.
So my final thought is that whatever you've implemented as you're thinking deeply about equity and racial justice in your classroom, to not let that fall off after the pandemic ends. And because it would be so easy for us to fall back into our natural habits once we're back in a more familiar environment of face-to-face. So I'm really hoping that the lessons that we're learning and the things that we have implemented now in order to address the very real and existent equity gaps are things that will stick. And also, for those of you wondering how to create a more equitable environment, I would say one of the things that has helped me on my journey is having wonderful colleagues, like all of us in this group here, who I can communicate honestly with, and who I know I can depend on to give me honest feedback, and creating that environment in your classroom too, so that students feel safe enough to communicate their concerns with you and listening to that student feedback. So yeah, I'm really hoping that this equity and even the social and racial justice movements that have kind of been pushed to the forefront during the pandemic, that we don't lose sight of it once things return back to normal, whatever that is.
Thank you for joining our presentation. From our conversation, we have identified a number of considerations for equitable teaching in ESOL classrooms. Exploring equity through these lenses can help us create an equitable learning environment for our ESL students. Our handout provides an overview of each concept with some questions to consider. You will also see a list of recommended readings and references that we hope will serve as inspirations to you. Thank you again, and we hope you have a wonderful day.